Hello everybody, I'm Ajit K. Mishra. I'm back with another session on communication skills. This time I'm going to talk about listening skills and how they play an important role in our everyday life, especially in our professional lives. So, listening is very, very important, but unfortunately most people do not attach a great significance to it, because it's a passive skill, most people think, but that's not the case. It's not a passive skill, it's a very, very active skill, because we keep listening one or the other thing every now and then. So we cannot afford to close our ears and say we're not listening. People do that, of course, but whenever that happens, that leads to problems. So when people are not listening to each other properly, when people develop poor listening skills, that leads to several problems, both in the personal lives and the professional lives of people. So listening plays a very, very important role in the entire communication process, because it is the most important aspect of the communication chain. So listening is not a passive activity, it is an active activity, and people have to take care of listening so that it doesn't lead to problems. So when we look at different aspects or the result of poor listening, we'll find that poor listening actually leads to the deterioration of trust and the weakening of communication. So if I do not listen to people properly, that will not lead to the building of trust. It will definitely destroy trust. And when that happens, it will definitely weaken the communication between the two of us. I'll not be feeling like communicating with the other person, and the other person will also not be feeling like communicating with me, because there is no trust. So trust deficit or the loss of trust is something that nobody can afford when it comes to communication situations. So poor listening results in a major problem, that is the deterioration of trust and the weakening of communication. If you remember, in one of my past sessions, I told you that the primary goal of communication is to build trust and to develop a positive relationship. So if that doesn't happen, there'll be no team working, there'll be no cooperation, there'll be no collaboration, and there'll be no productivity. So the building of trust is one of the most important goals of all communication. So poor listening skill, which is an important aspect of communication, will lead to problems. So therefore, the right kind of listening skills need to be developed so that trust is built and communication is strengthened. Poor listening skills, which actually maligns the objective of communication, also leads to assumptions and misunderstandings. So, for example, if I'm not listening to somebody clearly or properly, there's every possibility that I'll end up building assumptions about the person because I did not listen to the person clearly and carefully. When that happens, that will lead to assumptions. I'll end up assuming something completely on my own. I may be biased, I may be prejudiced in my approach to the person because I have not listened to the person carefully. So when that happens, that will lead to misunderstandings, and that will in turn lead to conflicts, because poor listening results in misunderstandings as well. If I don't listen to somebody clearly, there is every possibility that we'll misunderstand. Instead of understanding, I'll end up misunderstanding the person, and that will create problems. Besides, poor listening also leads to hurt feelings and poor team cohesion. So in my past session, I talked about how communication plays a very important role when it comes to team building and team working. Team building and team working depend a lot on team cohesion, how nicely team members gel with each other, how nicely team members become a cohesive unit. If that doesn't happen, it will lead to disoriented team building processes. So, poor listening leads to poor team cohesion. Besides, it also leads to hurt feelings, because when somebody is saying something and the listener doesn't at all listen to the person, the speaker is bound to be hurt. The speaker is bound to feel neglected, ignored, and that will lead to some kind of hurt feeling in the speaker, and that will never lead to any trust building or positive relationship between the speaker and the listener. So, poor listening also results in errors and ineffective decisions, because if somebody doesn't listen to a content, a speech, there is every chance that the person will adopt an erroneous approach while making decisions. In board meetings at organizations, there are members who attend meetings. They don't listen properly. They are poor listeners, and when that happens, they cannot make decisions. Even if they make decisions, they will be ineffective because they have not listened to the entire thing clearly. So that will lead to errors because somebody hasn't listened to the thing clearly. So that's a big problem. And then when we look at the other side of poor listening skills, we find that there are certain very poor listening styles that are adopted by people regularly. So those people who are poor listeners, they have certain poor listening styles. So let's take those styles one by one so that we can understand the poor listening styles, and that will give us a cue to how we can think of overcoming these poor listening styles, or how we can help others overcome these poor listening styles. To start with, the first one is spacing out. It's a very bad, poor listening style. If a person has spacing out listening style, which is a very poor listening style, the person is bound to ignore the speaker because the person's mind is concentrated on something else. I may have my eyes fixed on you, but I'm not with you. I'm not listening to you. My mind is fixed with something else. My mind is focused on something else. I'm physically with you, but I'm mentally elsewhere or psychologically elsewhere. So, spacing out is a major problem, and there are so many people who actually experience this problem. Most often, they are physically present and they are not psychologically present there, because while listening to somebody or something, or at least showing that they are listening to somebody or something, they are actually psychologically present elsewhere. So they do not listen to the speaker properly, and that leads to problems. The other poor listening style is pretend listening. This is the style in which people actually show that you are paying a lot of attention to the speaker, and then in order to prove that they are actually paying attention to the speaker, they would be saying discourse markers in between, like yeah, sounds great, but they are not actually listening. They just use these discourse markers to pretend that they are listening, but they're not actually listening. They're not focused on the speech. They're not listening. They're not bothered about it. So if this is a problem, that you face, or if I also face a problem like this, I need to be very, very careful about it so that I overcome this problem of mine. And then there is a kind of listening style that is called selective listening. And selective listening is a type of listening when we listen to someone by paying attention to only certain parts of the speech. That means we are not listening to the whole speech, we're just paying attention to some parts of the speech. We are selecting which parts to listen to and which parts not to listen to or drop from the listening activity. When that happens, that will lead to some kind of biases, prejudices, because we are adopting a selective approach. So selective listening is again a very poor listening style. Word listening, when, for example, I'm talking to someone and the person is only listening to my words, not to the emotional composition behind my words. I must tell you that whenever we speak, we use words, they are not just words. They carry a certain emotional element with them. So, for example, if I'm happy, I'll say happy. That means I'm actually happy. I'm experiencing that emotion. If I say I'm sad, I don't feel like doing anything. I'm completely, overworked and stressed. That means I'm not feeling well. There's some problem with me. So I'm trying to express my emotional state, my physical condition, my emotional condition through the use of those words. But there are people who do not take care of the emotional composition behind the words. Instead, they just focus on the words. Okay, this person said these words only, and these people are not worried about the emotional composition. Finally, there is another poor listening style which is called self-centered listening. When we are speaking to someone and the person only thinks about what he or she believes in, what he or she thinks about it, rather than taking care of the perspective or the point of view of the speaker, such listeners, they always think about that particular thing from their perspective. And that's exactly where the problem occurs. They end up listening poorly to such people. So there are a few poor listening responses as well. Judging is one such response. It's a very poor listening response. When we are speaking to someone, if the person begins to judge us on the basis of what we are saying, not by listening to us properly, rather by either selectively listening to us or adopting a prejudiced, biased listening, or adopting any other poor listening style like word listening, self-centered listening, such people, such listeners begin to judge us. When that happens, that leads to problems, because you feel, the speaker feels hurt, the speaker feels absolutely out of sync with the listener. So judging is a very poor listening response. And then advising, again, is a poor listening response. When we are talking to someone and the person begins to give us advice from their own experiences, instead of trying to completely understand us. So you're speaking to somebody and you're surprised to see that that somebody is suddenly beginning to give you advice instead of listening to you or trying to understand you. And then that's a problem. That's a big problem. A third poor listening response is probing. Probing is when we are talking and people ask us questions. And we're not ready for those questions, because when we begin to talk about certain things, we expect some time, some space, so that we can talk and at the end of it, we can take questions. But there are certain poor listening responses which lead to interruptions, and such poor listening skills actually end up asking lots of questions even before the speaker is ready. So these are some of the poor listening responses that we need to take care of if we have to overcome these listening issues. One big reason why I started with listening issues or problems associated with listening is that I wanted to, wake you up to the challenges associated with listening first, so that I can walk you through the world of listening styles or listening skills, and then with the help of those skills, you can overcome these challenges. So that's all for this session. So thank you for joining me. I hope you have enjoyed, and I'm sure you're going to explore this yet further. So thank you again for joining me. Bye-bye.